It's a confirmable truth that most presidents want to pivot to Asia, but the Middle East won't let them. Now it's Joe Biden's turn. He's wrestling with the Middle East crisis pretty much beyond his control, and he's experiencing the fallout here at home. Tonight, we'll examine how he's navigating the overlapping domestic and global challenges created by the Israel-Hamas war. Next.
This is Washington Week with The Atlantic. Corporate funding provided by
Consumer Cellular. This is Sam. How may I help you? This is a pocket dial. Well, somebody's pocket.
Thought I'd let you know that with Consumer Cellular,
You get nationwide coverage with no contract. That's kind of our thing.
have a nice day.
Certified financial planner professionals are proud to support Washington Week with The Atlantic. CFP professionals are committed to acting in their clients' best interest. More information at letsmakeaplan.org.
Additional funding is provided by Koo and Patricia Ewan through the Ewan Foundation, committed to bridging cultural differences in our communities. Sandra and Carl DeLay Magnuson, Rose Herschel and Andy Shreves, Robert and Susan Rosenbaum, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you. Once again from Washington, Editor-in-Chief of The Atlantic and moderator, Jeffrey Goldberg.
Good evening and welcome to Washington Week. The actual war is in Gaza, but you wouldn't know it from news coverage this week of American campuses. In the old days, when someone talked about chaos in Colombia, you would immediately think of Medellin. Joe Biden and Donald Trump are each trying to address Middle East conflict and campus unrest, and I'll talk about this tonight with Eric Cortellessa, a staff writer at The Time, who just conducted 2 epic interviews with Donald Trump. Franklin Foer, my colleague and a staff writer at The Atlantic, is just back from Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Israel. Asma Khalid is a White House correspondent for NPR and the co-host of the NPR Politics podcast. And Nancy Youssef is a national security correspondent at the Wall Street Journal. Thank you all for joining me. It's been a challenging week for Joe Biden, among other people, mostly university presidents and world leaders. I want to read something to you that David Graham wrote in The Atlantic about Biden's speech on anti-Semitism. He wrote today, this is yesterday, he wrote today, Biden's patience ran out. In brief remarks at the White House, he affirmed the importance of free speech, but mostly seemed intent on delivering a message of law and order. And let's listen to Biden's speech a little bit here.
I understand people have strong feelings and deep convictions. In America, we respect the right and protect the right for them to express that. But it doesn't mean anything goes. It needs to be done without violence, without destruction, without hate, and within the law.
Asma, in some ways, Joe Biden is sort of addressing the near future, meaning August in Chicago. That's what it seemed to me, at least.
Yeah, I mean, and you're speaking about the Democratic convention, right? That's
what he doesn't want is what Hubert Humphrey got in 1968.
And people have these memories, right, of 1968, and there was violence there. Look, I mean, I will say that I think Chicago, and I've long felt this, is certainly a viability. There's a lot of elements that could certainly lead to predictable unpredictability there. It has the largest Palestinian-American population in Cook County. It's a real progressive base of a city, not to mention the fact that my understanding is all the protests have been permitted for Grant Park, which is about 3 miles away from United Center, where the convention will be held. Chicago PD may not let them out. I mean, there's a whole lot of elements that are ripe for this. But I do think one thing about what Biden said that's interesting is he certainly was speaking to this issue of law and order. His comments also came after Donald Trump spoke, and they came after, frankly, days of public silence. I mean, many of us reporters in the press briefing were asking repeatedly about the protests, about, concerns of use of police excessive force. And one thing that's notable is he didn't mention the police response at all in his public remarks.
Right. Well, Frank, you're a student of Joe Biden, biographer of Joe Biden, in fact. It's sort of like this moment reminded me of 2020, summer of 2020, when Joe Biden and many Democrats are under pressure to align themselves with abolish the police. And Joe Biden, to his credit. I mean, he won in part because of this. He wasn't listening to the Twitter left so much as the kind of the broad center, including in the black community, Jim Clyburn and all the rest, and many people who were saying, we're not going to abolish the police. We need better policing. This is kind of the same vibe, at least. He's saying, you know what, you've gone too far.
Yeah, on culture war issues, he's lived through so many battles in the past, and he has very hardened instincts when they come to them. And his instinct is always going to be to side on the issue of law and order. He was the author of the crime bill, and that's just his fundamental instincts. And he's torn to some extent between these elements in the base of the party, the progressive wing of the party, that have tried to elevate this into a dominant issue. And then he looks at the other parts of the polls, and he looks at the voters that he needs in the middle, and he sees that they believe that the college campuses are not being treated harshly enough. And he sees Trump, and he sees the ways that Republicans are trying to, crime was a primary issue for them. It's disappeared. They've replaced it with the campus protests.
Right. Eric, you practically live at Mar-a-Lago now. Just want to know for the record that you don't actually live at Mar-a-Lago, in case anybody tweets on that. But you're very, very tied into what they're saying right now down in Florida, not only Trump, but the campaign. How do you expect them to try to exploit this moment?
Well, I think Donald Trump is going to try to exploit it as much as he can. I think he sees it as a real vulnerability for Donald Trump. And, he sees this as a way to sort of fracture the Democratic coalition in a way that could work to his advantage in a few key swing states, particularly Michigan. And so, this is where Donald Trump wants to keep the focus in the coming months. Because
chaos.
Absolutely. And the fact that, it's sort of a Democrats in disarray narrative that he's going to, really try to capitalize on.
Right. If he weren't running against Donald Trump, would Joe Biden be so keen on seeing an end to these demonstrations?
No. I mean, we got to remember that this is also tied in with the larger policy that he's trying to conduct in the Middle East. And people in the Middle East are watching these protests, and it's affecting their calculations, and it's complicating in different ways his ability to end the war.
Right. Nancy, let's talk about the actual war. Give us the state of play at the moment, and we'll talk to Frank about the trip he was on with the Secretary of State. But it seems that there's a lot of pieces in motion right now. Where are we?
So this week started optimistically that we would see some progress on the peace deal, and it has three elements. It attempts to get a 6-week ceasefire. It attempts to get a partial release of hostages, 33 Israelis for hundreds of Palestinian prisoners, and it seeks what it describes as a permanent calm. The challenge is, we heard from Bibi Netanyahu that the Rafah operation would continue regardless of whether there was a peace deal or not. And so you have both sides now trying to reach an agreement that potentially puts them in danger. For Israel, the question becomes, will they accept a peace agreement that does not allow them to go into Rafah, and in doing so not achieve the total victory that they've promised their people?
When you say a peace agreement, you're talking more of like a permanent, semi-permanent ceasefire.
That's right.
Yeah, okay.
And Hamas's sort of challenge is, would they give up their strongest bargaining chip, Israeli soldiers, and
the
not
kidnapped soldiers?
That's right.
Yeah, okay.
Those hostages.
Yeah.
And not secure a permanent peace. And so what you're seeing now is this sort of discussion of what that permanent calm looks like. How do you define it? And is there an agreement that you can reach that allows both sides to come to the table and give up really key parts and strengths and demands from their coalitions and in the case of Hamas, their survival?
How optimistic should we be that there's going to be progress?
I think it's really hard to say because it's so vague right now, the description of what happens after 6 weeks. And there's so much at stake for both sides. We haven't seen anything right now that says that it's imminent. Having said that, so much of the deal has been worked out, that this is the last thing that really has to be ironed out. It's the most complex part of the deal to be ironed out because it really gets at the potential end of the war, or if not, what does something short of a Rafah operation look like that allows Israel to say that it has secured its nation from the Hamas threat?
Right. Frank, you were on the trip. Talk about the role of Saudi Arabia in all of this.
Right. So what's happening right now is we're trying to get to this pause in the war. The administration is essentially trying to wedge its arm into the door to buy a little bit of calm and then to let things go from there. At the end,
and they're trying to do that with Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister. He's the main object of the lobbying.
No. Well, so right now, the main object is there's Sinwar, the head of Hamas in Gaza, is the person who has the ultimate veto power of the deal right now.
But the U.S. has no influence over Sinwar.
No, nobody has any influence over him, which is part of the problem. The Qatari, who house the political wing of Hamas in Doha, have pressured them, and they've essentially signed off on this piece of the deal. And so there's nothing that they can do to influence this guy who's sitting in a tunnel, who has to make his own, who they describe as being kind of erratic, who's in the middle of a war, who's surrounded by hostages.
He has hostages literally as human shields. Right,
exactly.
Okay. So go on. Where does Saudi Arabia and where does normalization fit into this scheme?
So if the administration is able to get to a point where there's a calm in the conflict, they're working towards a deal with Saudi Arabia that would allow for a bilateral defense agreement with the United States and paving the way for a normalization deal with Israel. And that's going to happen simultaneous to another deal that's being brokered with the Arab countries to deal with post-war reconstruction of Gaza. Who will govern the country? Who will pay for the reconstruction of Gaza? It's kind of a Rube Goldberg contraption of diplomacy, that they need to do something that calms things down now and then kind of shoots the moon in order to get to some sort of more permanent.
Could I just add to that?
Yeah.
You know what I think is interesting? They're trying to reach these normalization deals at a time when whatever happens, the region is different because of these wars. So I think these deals are being negotiated when in an environment that is constantly shifting in ways that we don't fully understand.
Yeah, no, you can picture Blinken flying back and forth between these capitals, and you land in one, and the reality has changed entirely because of action somewhere else. Asma, talk about the White House and their level of confidence that they're going to be able to pull this contraption off.
Yeah, no, I mean, I've been struck by the fact that for months, I mean, frankly, even before that, I would say going back even 2 years ago, I traveled with Biden to both Israel and Saudi Arabia, and even at that time, they were really optimistic about this deal of so-called, extending the Abraham Accords. It's long been something that this White House wants to achieve and would see, I think, as a great success. But I have, I think, a lot of skepticism about the ability to achieve this. And I guess my primary question is, I don't know the answer to this. Those of you who cover, I think, sort of national security might have a better idea of what is the incentive for MBS to really negotiate with the Biden administration over a potential
Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince
of Saudi Arabia, over a potential, let's say, of a Donald Trump second term. So in my sense, I don't see what incentive there is to really negotiate a solid deal before November. And certainly this administration would like to see a deal as soon as possible.
You mean the Saudis would much rather have a deal with Donald Trump than
I think
Joe
that
Biden?
both the Saudis and Israelis, you saw, were very close to the former Trump administration. And who knows what the second term of a Trump administration would look like.
Wonderful pivot. Wonderful pivot. Wow, she's such a pro. Eric, in your interviews with Donald Trump, he talked quite a bit and in a surprising way about Netanyahu, who one could surmise over the last couple of months was kind of looking forward to the possibility of a return of Donald Trump. Turns out Donald Trump doesn't seem to like Netanyahu very much. Can you give us a sense of what Donald Trump told you?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, there's a clear bitterness between them, right? Donald Trump, I mean, you could feel it in the room. I asked Donald Trump when we spoke at Mar-a-Lago, do you think it's time for Netanyahu to go? And his answer was, I had a bad experience with Bibi.
That was his literal answer.
That was his answer. We had a bad experience with Bibi. And he mentioned the operation to take out Qasem Soleimani, the top Iranian general. It was supposed to be a bilateral operation between Israel and the United States. Bibi backed out at the last minute. He cites that as the source of the tension. Also, many have speculated that what really pissed him off was when Joe Biden, when Netanyahu congratulated Joe Biden for winning the election, that was a bridge too far. But right now, Donald Trump has said to me, look, I get along with Benny Gantz. There are others in Israel I've worked with who could be good. That was quite a stinging
member
rebuke.
of the war cabinet, leads another party within the coalition.
And so, I mean, just saying that he had a bad experience with Netanyahu, and very pointedly blaming Netanyahu for allowing the October 7th massacre to happen on his watch, and then saying that others could do the job well, was a stinging rebuke to Netanyahu.
Wait, go into that a little bit more. Trump is saying that Netanyahu is responsible for Israeli security and failed.
Well, he told me that Netanyahu has been rightfully criticized for what happened on October 7th.
So there was no warmth in the way he talked about Netanyahu at all?
Not really, no.
Yeah. So, Frank, what does that mean for the relationship between Netanyahu and Biden? it would seem that Netanyahu could read what he just reported and say, well, maybe I better make a deal with Biden because this guy is not my friend.
I mean, Netanyahu, as you know better than he's a tactician whose goal is to survive until tomorrow. I don't think his timeline extends to the next election. He's worried about surviving a ceasefire deal. He's worried about what's going to happen in Rafah. He's worried that his promises of total victory, which he makes every day, are never going to come true. And at some point, he's going to start to pay a price for the failures of October 7th, the failures of this campaign in Gaza to fully eradicate Hamas. He's not thinking as far as November.
And if I could just add to that, President Biden has tied himself to Netanyahu. He has really embraced Netanyahu. His survival politically also is intertwined with Netanyahu's in the sense that he has said he's going to back him. He's criticized him recently, but he hasn't signaled that he's willing to, for example, not provide weapons or in any way put increased pressure on him to reach a deal faster than Netanyahu's ready. He has said we don't support the Rafah operation, but we haven't seen any strong pressure on the Netanyahu government to reach a deal or to curtail their ability to conduct these operations in terms of the weapons that they're provided from the United States.
Right. Asma, a political question. How much, in your mind, do the campus protests and the continued uncertainties that we're talking about, how much is it actually hurting Joe Biden in polls today?
Yeah.
Because he's not doing that well
He's
in
not
the
doing that
polls
well
today
in polls,
anyway.
but for a variety of reasons, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I would argue that when you look at polls and voters consistently complain about high prices and inflation. And I hear this all the time. I was just recently out in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania area. But at the same time, I think what's interesting in some polls is people also, talk about the border, they talk about democracy, abortion, obviously depending on where their partisan leanings are. Yeah. I don't know. I was just looking at an ABC poll that came out, and it said about 4 in 10 voters disagree with Biden's handling of this war. It is up a bit from January, so that's not headed in the right trajectory for him. But the question of is it going to be determinative of how they vote, I don't know the answer to that. I would also, though, argue there were slim margins for Joe Biden in some states. You look at a state like Georgia, 11,000 votes? You can't really afford to lose really any part of that coalition.
Right.
In some states.
Michigan was said to be the state where he would take the biggest hit because of this, but it actually happens to be the state that he's performing strongest in of all the swing states. And he's scraping bottom with young voters. His approval rating is 17% with voters under 30. But when you ask them what are your biggest concerns, Gaza falls 15 out of 20 on that list. It's not
that Harvard Institute poll, which does really good polling on young voters. So I think that, to me, it's really, really unclear. I will say, to me, this election feels more unclear, certainly a lot more unclear than in 4 years ago.
Right. Let's come back to the interview or interviews that you did. You did 2 interviews with Donald Trump for this cover story that you wrote. Apart from the Middle East conversation, which you kind of dipped in and out of, talk about 2 things: your impressions of Trump, cogency, grip on the issues, how the trials seem to be, or the trial right now and the pending trials seem to be affecting his mood and concentration. And then tell us a little bit about what struck you the most about the things that he told you.
Well, I mean, Donald Trump appeared, as I write in the piece, ever more assertive and confident. Right now, he feels like he's got a better opportunity to win the White House than he did at any point in the 2016 or 2020 campaigns. He's winning in most polls, including in several of the 7 battleground states that are going to determine the outcome of the election. So, Donald Trump is in a position right now where he's planning, if he wins, to come into office January 2025 and to consolidate the power of government inside the office of the presidency. Donald Trump didn't really outline for me many legislative initiatives. He really wants to carry out his second-term agenda through his executive authority. And that, goes to his immigration plan, including carrying out a massive deportation operation that would remove as many as 11 million migrants from the country. That goes to having a greater hand in Justice Department prosecutions than we've seen in previous presidents. He wants to restore the power of impoundment, which means to withhold congressionally appropriated funds. This was a favorite maneuver of Richard Nixon's, who used it to hold money from the Environmental Protection Agency and affordable housing, and
I was struck by that. It's not the most dramatic thing compared to immigration and abortion, but I was struck by that because didn't Congress pass laws after Nixon to restrict a president's ability to impound?
So the Impoundment Control Act was passed in 1974 to restrict the use of congressionally appropriated funds. Donald Trump and his allies.
Aren't you glad you memorized that now?
Yeah. I know more about impoundment than most Americans. But look, Donald Trump has said that he and his advisors have said that they see that as unconstitutional and that they would try to challenge it through a variety of ways. They might engineer a legal battle for it. They might try to pass a law through Congress to overturn that Impoundment Control Act of 1974 if they have majorities in the House and Senate. Donald Trump wants to expand the powers of the presidency.
You call it the imperial president. You say that he's trying to design an imperial presidency. Mm-hmm. Imperial meaning concentration of power in one branch.
Yeah, I mean, concentrated power in one branch, and, he wants to be able to do things on his own through his own executive power. He feels that if he's won the election, that is a mandate for the vision that he has campaigned on.
Right. Asma, what struck you about the things that Donald Trump has been talking about recently? I know we were talking a little bit before about immigration.
Yeah, I mean, the abortion is really noteworthy as well, how he spoke about abortion, and I'm curious what struck you about that, because to me that is single-handedly the most I think, decisive issue that many Democrats see, and they think they have an advantage there. He seemed to suggest, I guess, that he would, not veto, it sounded like, a federal ban, right, if it came up to him.
We had a line of questioning where I asked Donald Trump, quite pointedly, President Trump, if a bill came to your desk that would impose any federal restrictions on abortion, would you veto it? And he said, I don't have to veto it. It'll never happen anyways. We'll never have a 60-vote majority. So I said, so just, will you not rule it out? And I asked him at least 3 times, and he said no. And then I asked him about, the functional outcome of his position of that this is a states' rights issue. So I said, President Trump, would you be comfortable with states prosecuting women who have had abortions after the ban? He said, it's totally irrelevant whether I'm comfortable or not because the states are going to make those decisions. I said, President Trump, should states be able to monitor women's pregnancies to know whether they've gotten an abortion after the ban? He said they might do that. So that is the ground that Donald Trump is going to trod in the coming months before the election, which is this is a states' rights issue, and states can make their own policies in whichever direction they want on abortion.
That's very dramatic. Also, something that struck me as equally dramatic or in the same range is the promise or threat to use American troops to use at least the National Guard, if not regular troops, to engage in roundups of illegal immigrants, mass deportations.
A violation of posse comitatus.
Yeah, you're an expert. You cover the Pentagon. Tell me, when you hear that, do you think it's even plausible? I mean, we've spent years, among other, me and you, writing about the Pentagon and its uneasy relationship, uneasy is almost euphemistic, with Donald Trump and his ideas of what the military should be used for. What would happen if Donald Trump says to the generals, you're now being deployed domestically to get all these undocumented aliens out of the country?
So it would be a violation of posse comitatus, which was passed, I did not memorize, so I might have it wrong, 1878. And the idea is that you cannot use the U.S. military to go after civilians. His answer to you is, well, they're not civilians. Mm-hmm. The challenge that he puts his military generals in is they are not, under their oath, allowed to follow an order that is illegal or immoral, and he would put that question potentially to them to have to answer. And also, we have really taken pride in this country. Most militaries in the world are built to combat internal threats. The United States military is built for external threats. And once you start having boots on the ground and uniforms on American streets, it changes the very relationship the United States military has with the American people and its function in our country. So we saw that on January 6th. It was startling in some ways to sort of see people in uniform going after the protesters because I'm not used to it, seeing it. That would be another extension of it. It becomes a legal challenge, some would argue, and it really forces the military to make a decision between how they interpret the law and how to follow the orders of the commander-in-chief.
You think he was bluffing?
I think that if there's anything Donald Trump plans to go full throttle on in a second term, it's immigration. He's planning, if he wins, so day one, a slew of executive orders that would restore the policies he had in place in the first term. Remain in Mexico, Title 42. He's going to allocate money, probably from the military, to resume construction of the border wall. But when it comes to this deportation operation, Donald Trump doesn't want to not fulfill this particular campaign promise. So, I asked him some very specific questions about how he would do that. And as you say, he would be willing to use the military I asked him about the U.S. law that prohibits the use of military on civilians. He doesn't consider undocumented migrant civilians. But there are other things he's going to do to try and, expand presidential power in this realm. He said that he would try to induce local and state police departments to participate by tying federal funding to their involvement. He said if they don't, they won't partake in the riches.
Right. Frank, a few seconds left. Is Joe Biden doing enough from his perspective to stop Trump from using immigration the way he's using it?
I don't know if you can do anything to rig against this. What was incredible about this is just the way in which you got to see inside Donald Trump's brain and all the authoritarian ideas that are rattling around inside there.
It's a good note to leave it on. We'll probably pick up that conversation next week, but unfortunately we need to leave it there for now. I want to thank our panelists for joining us and for sharing their reporting. Please visit theatlantic.com to read David Frum's piece on President Biden's upcoming speech on Holocaust Remembrance Day. I'm Jeffrey Goldberg. Good night from Washington.
Corporate funding for Washington Week with The Atlantic is provided by Consumer Cellular.
Certified financial planner professionals are proud to support Washington Week with The Atlantic. CFP professionals are committed to acting in their clients' best interest. More information at letsmakeaplan.org.
Additional funding is provided by Koo and Patricia Ewens for the Ewen Foundation, committed to bridging cultural differences in our communities. Sandra and Carl DeLay Magnuson, Rose Herschel and Andy Shreves, Robert and Susan Rosenbaum, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
You're watching PBS.